what is it, like 20 diapers? It's like 20 diapers. Is that about right? Or they like a quarter or something?
Leo's fighting right now.
Okay. Sweet. Yeah. Cool. So, can everybody hear me all right? Can you hear me on the call?
Yeah, but I have to get there.
Yeah.
Sweet. And everybody can see it here. You can see my screen?
Yes.
This is ridiculous. I'm like casting my screen to like 4 different things simultaneously. All right. Cool. Well, yeah, so this talk's kind of a culmination of like the last I guess the first quarter of the year really. I think the goal really was to try to just solidify and automate a lot of our processes as far as stuff like Git and deployment and how we do stuff in the cloud. So slowly but surely we started realizing that if we did things the right way, we could achieve what we're calling the dream, which is, you could provision your cloud infrastructure exactly the same way you provision your local dev environment, and oh yeah, it's in version control, so it's super sweet. So let's just real quick, I wanted to do a couple of bullets here, what is the dream, the goal, so let's make something clients want, let's not make a big old turd, and obviously it should be easy to bring on new developers. Likewise, it should be easy to deploy to wherever, whether it's AWS or GoDaddy server or what's another one, DigitalOcean, something like that. Okay. And once we're there, it should be easy to respond to load demand, like scaling up and down. And then after we do all this work to make it super complicated, let's make sure it's not. You don't have to have built the thing to know how to configure it and turn all the knobs, basically. Okay. So before I sort of get into the I guess cloud infrastructure stuff, I just wanted to take a quick second and maybe go over an easy to understand Git flow. So this is how GitHub. This is sort of how they use Git, right? So there's a production branch master. There's some sort of QA, server quality assurance branch, which I'm calling dev. You always branch dev from master, feature branches. This is kind of interesting. This always takes feature branches from the dev branch, and then you basically always have to merge back in. The idea here, right, is that you could also hook up, this lends itself pretty amazingly to, if you had a domain that is production, and then maybe you have some sort of dev domain that, you try out new features, you work out all the bugs, but it's still a place that everybody can go to and try out the thing that you're working on. Right? Cool. So, do you have any questions about that flow? Anything? Okay.
Branch from dev?
Yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. I actually, in researching this, I was kind of like, okay, I guess that makes sense.
I always thought it was branch from master.
There's actually, they complicate it a little further, and it's that anytime you are merging into master, you create a sort of a release branch.
To do the merge in. So
yeah. To me, it's kind of the same wiki as we found the whole. There's a. I guess I can put this here, but there's a git merge -- no ff that is super large for you guys to see here, right? And basically what that says is if you, this is a good example, what we're looking at here. Yeah, so by default, if I were to merge this dev branch into master, there are no commits that happen to master while I was on dev. So whenever I merge dev back into master, there's not going to be some nasty merge conflict, or there's not even going to be a new commit. This the -- no ff says I don't want to fast forward. I want to actually create a commit for this moment in time when I did the merge, right? That turns out to be actually kind of useful later when we start talking about code ship, which is sort of our launch point for continuous integration. But we'll get to that. Anyway, so that's just like a quick overview. I thought it would be useful for us to see that because I think it lends itself to how we're going to end up using our different stacks.
There's no staging.
So dev is kind of we at least amongst APAX we've tend to use the term dev to be synonymous with the dev domain. Therefore, it's sort of like the QA server.
I know sometimes though there's a difference between like a dev, staging, and production.
Oh, right, yeah. Another thing you could do is you could have a branch that actually has its own stack up in the cloud, but it's not meant to ever be stable. You can literally push whatever the hell you want to it, but the idea is that it is, in the cloud and you can access it. So let's see like let's sort of like paint the picture of what the problem is, okay? If you've ever deployed to like a GoDaddy server, or even you're savvy enough to have pulled up an EC2 instance or a DigitalOcean droplet, or I don't know what all, whatever, you've experienced this setup, right? Let's just say this is like a WordPress app server, okay? And there's some SQL database behind it. One problem that you might start running into is, there's a crap ton of people hitting my site right now. And the common solution for that is to stick multiple app servers that can handle just as many or more requests per second behind what's called a load balancer. And instead of pointing your domain at the individual instances, which have their own IPs, you point it to the load balancer, right? So this starts presenting problems. One thing is, obviously now if you have two app servers, they have to have all your code on it. Has to be configured to point to the right database. And then what happens if some system level dependency like PHP or whatever changes, right? That means you have to go into every one of those app servers and change it. What if you swap out databases? Well, I have to go into every app server and change their config, okay? So you can already sort of see a problem here. One solution that's kind of like an older solution is to, and I actually think AWS supports this, is creating like an image, what's called AMI, of these servers. And basically, if you want to scale up and scale down, it's smart enough to just point it to an AMI and says, oh, I need a new instance. Where's my AMI? I'll spin up from that, right? That's cool, but then updating that is a nightmare. Managing that's a nightmare. Then, what if you run into this, right? I got two domains, have this whole stack duplicated, and maybe there's a new feature that comes out on dev that completely changes dependencies here. Well, you don't want that on your production one. You don't have to roll it out yet. So you can sort of see the problem that we're trying to tackle here. Okay, that's not even to mention, obviously, getting all this mess running locally, right? Okay, so enter Chef, stage center. Okay, so what is Chef? I actually already did a talk on this, so I'm not going to get into too much detail about just writing a cookbook, but I did want to at least show an example here on the left. That is what, like 1, 2, 3, 4 statements, and it installs Apache, creates a virtual host, points it to a doc root, and restarts Apache. And spoiler alert, that works on every OS that those recipes support, which includes stuff like Windows, Linux, lots of different flavors of Linux, Mac OS X, right? So that's sort of the power of Chef, and it's portable, obviously. Another thing that it allows you to do is sort of divvy up your work into smaller tasks and sort of only opt in to the things you need for the given context, right? This is an example of a pretty complicated Django app that has all sorts of recipes, but maybe we don't need the code. Maybe we already checked out the code. Maybe we need a dev database because we're not using RDS on Amazon or something like that. So you can sort of see where we're going here. But Chris, why is this so damn complicated, right? Like, why are we complicating this? Okay, so let's answer that by, I guess, conjuring up a pretty realistic, more complicated example. So we already seen this, right? So that's just a whatever app server behind a load balancer, and we have database. So what if we start realizing that, okay, I mean, this is a practical example that I ran into, is that maybe you need to import 10,000 users or something, and that process takes, let's call it several hours, right? Well, it turns out HTTP doesn't like that, right? If you try to upload and process and enter into the database, it's going to take a long time, and your HTTP request is going to time out. So a common solution to that problem is you have what's called a message queue. You have some sort of data store for that, and then you have these sweet little workers that are basically saying, hey, message queue database, do you have stuff for me to do? Do you have stuff for me to do? Do you have stuff for me to do? Right? It's constantly asking it, trying to pop stuff off the task queue, right? So that's a common solution to this. So, and just to give better labels to this, I call it app server and MQ database or data store. What about the scenario on AWS? These are EC2 instances. I have some RDS. In the case of this, it was a Django app running on these EC2 instances. And it made sense to use this message queue thing called Rabbitmq. And Celery workers are this it's basically just sitting there, like I said, popping off stuff to do. Okay, now you have to get that running locally, you have to get it running on the cloud, and you have to get it running on both the production and the dev environments. Okay? And I'm sure that configuration is going to change over time, right? You're going to find something that didn't work, and you may need to roll back, or maybe different for production, might be different for dev, right? So how does Chef solve this problem? Each of these things, each of these layers can have its own little run list of recipes, right? So this is an example on the app servers. I opted into, I need system dependencies, I need Apache, obviously I need the code for the app, and oh yeah, I need to do some managerial things like apply database by migrations and maybe pre-process some JavaScript or CSS or something like that, right? Whereas maybe on these Celery workers, sure, I need system level dependencies, but I don't need Apache. I don't care what Apache is. No one's ever going to ask me over HTTP what you got for me, right? But I do need the code because there's probably implementation for all these tasks that I'm supposed to do. And yeah, it also probably needs to do app-related things. And oh yeah, here's a recipe that nobody else needs. I need to know how to, configure and set up this whole message queue thing. All right. What's even cooler is this Rabbitmq thing. It doesn't need to know about any of that. It's just like, I'm just basically like a database for tasks, right? And then what's even more complicated, if you throw into this, is that you have to configure all these things to know about each other, right? And that, obviously, each of these things probably has like an IP address, and that's going to be different for your dev stack versus your production stack. Maybe locally, all this crap's installed on the same thing, your laptop, right? Normally, you just have this big, long-ass README that says, okay, you need to install Postgres. Okay, you need to figure out how to set up Celery. You need to figure out how to set up Rabbitmq. You need to get Django working. You have to do all this stuff, right? So already you can see, like, if you write the recipe once, it should, in theory, run everywhere. So let's now look at maybe like a cool example of how to deploy these things, right? Sure, it's cool you have this cookbook, but like, how do I get it on my server? How do I run it? Whatever. And really, there's like a couple of solutions to that. I'd actually painstakingly gone through the Chef server scenario of things, and the nice thing about Chef server is that it runs anywhere, right? You can register a GoDaddy instance or a DigitalOcean droplet or an EC2 instance, all with Chef server, and it's smart enough to say stuff like, oh, I need the Apache cookbook. Where do I go get it? It's like, well, I have it right here, right? Chef server just manages all your dependencies like that. It's pretty cool. However, managing sensitive data like database passwords or your Facebook secret key or whatever, right? You obviously don't want to like just have that stuff unencrypted, right? So Chef server gives you a way of doing that, but managing it is honestly a nightmare. Whereas OpsWorks is an AWS service that basically tries to solve these same problems. And it, I mean, I guess you could say the bad thing is you're stuck with AWS, but the good thing is it's on AWS. like there's not a better feature set out there other than AWS. It also makes managing sensitive data like database passwords and stuff like that stupid easy to configure. It makes scaling up and down stupid easy. The only really downside, I think, other than it being stuck with AWS, is that you kind of have to do some pre-processing. Where Chef Server, manages all your cookbook dependencies, OpsWorks kind of expects you to have all your dependencies in the same directory, right? So you may have to come up with sort of like a build process for your cookbook. That may sound daunting, but turns out this sweet thing called Berkshelf fixed all this for you, right? In fact, Berkshelf's actually useful for both Chef Server and OpsWorks. For you dudes that like playing League of Legends, you can thank Riot Games for making Berkshelf, because
It's really good.
yes, sir. Yeah,
Really?
yeah. The entire League infrastructure apparently is run using Chef, and they're the ones that kind of pioneered this Berkshelf.
They probably only have a couple side routes, right?
I think so.
Seems
yeah.
like every killed
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So I kind of forget what's up. Okay, so let's look at a not so complicated example. Okay. So this is, where's my cursor? There we go. This is the APAX AWS, right? So there's this cool thing called OpsWorks, and I created this thing called a stack called MyApp, right? And what this does, so let's look at layers here. You can already sort of see where we're going here. Basically, let's look at what an app server is. Sure, there's these really boring general settings, but what about recipes, right? What this does is instances, say EC2 instances, you can sort of specify a run list at certain lifecycle events of an EC2 instance, right? So there's some recipe, I love the jargon, in your Chef MyApp cookbook, right, called system, right? If I actually look, this particular cookbook, it happens to be on GitHub, just because I was kind of curious. I wanted to make it a public repo, and we've kind of been stuck with Bitbucket for a while, so I just wanted to try it out. Turns out I actually like Bitbucket better, by the way, so
Whoa.
yeah. Well, in terms of SSH key management, I'll get to why. Well, maybe I won't. I don't know. But anyway, so this is a cookbook. It says right here to provision the MyApp WordPress application, right? So right now this really doesn't have any of the application code, but what it does is it provides you some recipes for provisioning, whatever environment. So if I look at system, what does this do? It says, I'm going to include the apt recipe, the PHP one. Oh yeah, I need MySQL for PHP. It also installs Git and this other thing called SendMail for sending emails. Right. Likewise, it has server, which is slightly more complicated than the example I showed you earlier, but it's pretty darn close. Basically, just does some Apache module junk. But yeah, it also does some things for your local dev environment, which we'll get to here in a sec. But anyway, back to OpsWorks. This is just basically saying that I'm going to go get my cookbook from here, somewhere on S3. And yeah, I want to use these recipes when you get set up. And every time you deploy the app, I want to run the code one and this WordPress recipe. Okay. So how did the cookbook get here? And this is a segue really into a tool that APAX pays for, and if you're not using, you should totally be using. So CodeShip is basically it's a continuous integration server, but you don't have to host it, and it makes setting up jobs for when you push code to your repository super easy. Okay, so I basically created a project from a repository. Yeah, that's exactly how it works. And anytime you push your code to whatever branch, it comes in here and it runs a build. Now you may not have anything set up, but really the lifecycle is it runs tests, and if tests pass, it goes and runs any deployments for that branch, right? So this is the cookbook repository. And if I go in here to deployment, it does some stuff whenever you push to the master branch of the cookbook. It installs Burke Shelf, it runs this thing called Burke's Vendor, and then it zips it all up and pushes it to S3. That's what this does. Burke's Vendor is kind of what I was talking about, how Burke Shelf solves the problem of dependency management for you. So if we look in the code real quick, on our cookbook we have this sweet metadata Ruby file. And really in here we're just outlining, here are my dependencies, here are my other cookbooks that I need, right? I need apt, PHP, Apache, this MySQL thing, and there's just this open sort of database agnostic cookbook out there called Database, and I use that for the dev database recipe that I'll show you here in a sec. Right? But anyway, this zips it up and pushes it to S3. Right? So I obviously had to have, one thing that you would have to set up here is an S3 bucket. Right? So just to show you that I'm not crazy and this really isn't just magic, I have a chef-myapp S3 bucket, and in here is where CodeShip is pushing a zip of the cookbook to. And it even puts the version in here. That's actually kind of important because if you think about it, in OpsWorks land, I'm specifying a particular cookbook version to get, right? Well, this could you could very easily have maybe a dev stack and a production stack that point to two completely different cookbook versions, right? Which makes sense, right? Like maybe your dependencies change over time, right? So that's just pointing that out. So long and the short of it here is CodeShip is amazing, and if you're not using it already, it's a great way. So built in to Git are webhooks, right? That's just built in. Basically, CodeShip's just giving you a super sweet infrastructure on top of that all spawns from using Git webhooks. Okay. So I guess I just wanted to point out that, so locally I have checked out the myapp repo as well. Now I've actually already set up a domain on APAX dev to point to this that's been published. So this is just a vanilla WordPress site that I happen to install install a theme to. I think this is one of the themes that came with WordPress, but yeah, okay. And obviously, I guess one kind of interesting thing here, and this is sort of getting into the dream really, is that we were looking at the cookbook repository. Now let's look at the actual application repository. And the one kind of interesting thing here is that if you notice, I use what's called a Git submodule to point to the cookbook itself, right? So immediately what's so amazing about this is every commit of your application repository points to a particular commit on your cookbook repository, right? So at any given time, when you pull down the code and you initialize that submodule, you're going to get, both of those should be on the same page, basically. You're always going to have the right dependencies for that moment in the code, which is amazing. So real quick, let's just look. You notice I had the cookbook in a folder, and this is the actual code. This actually is a WordPress site that uses this Wordpress Skeleton template. I'm not going into detail with this, but the long and the short of it is it puts WordPress coincidentally into a submodule. I don't want to paint the picture that submodules are the solution to everything. In fact, in most cases, submodules are the devil. Okay, but in this particular case, they're very, very useful. So the main thing, I guess, to take away from WordPress Skeleton is that it factors out. It's WordPress for developers, to be honest. Okay, one of the biggest problems with WordPress is that your plugins and your themes and stuff are baked into the same source control as WordPress. This sort of factors that stuff out into this content folder so that you can keep those things in version control. Right? It's pretty amazing. I don't believe there are any plugins or themes in here just yet. Oh, I take that back. This already has a theme in it, and that happens to be what is plugged into on this server, right? So again, my app.apax dev was provisioned by this OpsWorks stack, right? And what's kind of cool is that if I go here to instances, I could very easily just click, I want a new instance. I don't want another micro. And it would create a new instance. I'd have to start it, but it would create a new instance. Now, this stack doesn't have a load balancer. If you think back to our picture, there is no load balancer on my stack currently. I don't actually intend to do that on this particular one. Long story why that didn't end up coming to fruition. But anyway, let's see. I'm going to go ahead and delete that because I don't actually want to spin up another micro instance. Okay, any questions so far before I go on? Okay, cool. So another thing that I was talking about was configuration, right? So if you noticed in the application repo, I have this local config, right? This is a very common sort of convention where if you look in the git ignore, it's actually git ignoring this local config guy. And the idea is that you always initialize your local config from some sample so that you know it's in the right format, but obviously the stuff that goes in here is going to be different. Like the database, in this particular case, it's just what database do I point to, right? So I would be asking the question, if I were you, well then Chris, how do you initialize this? And that's what's amazing is that that's done by recipe. So part of the code recipe is it goes and gets some stuff from this thing called app. What's app? If we look in OpsWorks, we have apps. And basically this is a place, it's kind of a way for you to house configuration stuff. I put stuff like, where should I go get the code from in here? And, oh yeah, what RDS instance should I use? This is kind of redundant in this case because I ended up putting the database stuff in what I'm trying to get to here, and that's environment variables. So what this does, if you look inside the cookbook, the code cookbook, it actually says, hey, go get the app source stuff. We got that from here. But then environment variables, that's the secret sauce. It grabs environment from this app thing, stuff's it in config. And if you look down here, what does this do? It goes and gets this get SSH key. It creates this get wrapper thing, and this is actually something that was always part of the Git program. Basically, you can specify this script to feed all your traffic through, right? It's basically another way of saying like when you SSH into a machine and you have a private key to do so. This basically wraps Git in that same sort of stuff, right? But what's cool is that this basically goes and grabs the code from wherever your config said to, and then the secret sauce here at the bottom is it says, I want to use this template local config sample, and I want to pass in these parameters I got from my OpsWorks application configuration, right? So I'll pull that up locally really quick, but local sample gets initialized to this stuff. I've revealed something from the future. Okay. All right. But anyway, that's sort of like a basic example of an app. So what I wanted to do to illustrate the power of all of this is actually make a change to this stack. I guess one.
Can you like really quickly just like summarize like the difference between layers, instances, apps, and stacks, and like just how they relate to each other?
Yeah. Oh, sure. It might be easier to actually show you an example. So this fit face off dev, it looked very, very similar to the picture that I showed you earlier. So I'll actually pull that up really quick. But this, now just so we remember, we have app servers, we have Rabbitmq, we have cellular workers, we have RDS. We have all this stuff, right? So what's that look like in OpsWorks land? So layers are really a way for you, I guess, custom layers anyway. At each one you specify recipes. It's basically a way for you to say, hey, when you spin up a new instance, here's how you should configure it. And oh yeah, after, at different lifecycle events, I want you to run these certain recipes, right? So for app servers, I need system, servers, I need the code, and this is some pre-processing and Django related things. But what's even cooler about this is you can specify stuff like, oh, when you create an instance here, I want you to put it behind this load balancer. Okay? And oh yeah, I also want you to apply these security groups to it. Right? So it automates all this stuff. So if I go into instances right now for this, I actually have a stopped instance for this particular stack. But I could keep adding more and more instances, and they all get provisioned exactly the same way. They pull down a fresh copy of the code, and they get configured correctly, right? It's actually even kind of cool, you know, this instances is really just a way for you to see running instances. But you notice down here I have cellular workers, Rabbitmq. All of these respond to a layer. Basically, it gives you a way of adding instances to them. It also enumerates stuff like your load balancer and RDS instances if you put those in here. Now, apps, however, as I showed you earlier, it's really a place for you to put configuration stuff. So I have a crap ton of environment variables in here just for the dev stack. I have stuff like database configuration, but also like Facebook app, AWS. You know, I do some S3 storage things in here. I need credentials for that stuff. And likewise, this is actually kind of cool. This says Rabbitmq Host. Here's where the Rabbitmq server is. Basically, this tells, in this picture, it tells, you know, EC2 instances and cellular workers where to go find this guy, right? They all get configured with the exact same app from OpsWorks, but these actually needed that host information so that Rabbitmq could, so you know where to go get it, basically. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess let me summarize real quick to make sure I understand. So stacks like everything you need to deploy FitFace off or whatever. A app is basically an instance will belong to an app, or a collection of instances will belong to an app if they have the same configuration or the same environment variables.
Actually,
belong to a layer if they have the same recipes.
So yeah, all instances belong to a layer. The one thing that I would change in what you said is that technically you can have multiple apps. But to me, yeah, I mean you could in theory have an app for Rabbitmq
Right.
and whatever, right? But there's going to be a lot of like, I guess, duplicated environment variables, and it made it a lot more. What's the word? I guess it made it a lot more simpler in the actual recipe, because if you notice, you know, in the actual recipe somewhere, I have to go get the app. This is just saying, hey, query OpsWorks for the first app that you find, right? That's all that's doing. Yeah, I'll come back to this.
Yeah, no, I think it's pretty clear.
Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to show you before we talk about making a change is we talked about how I have a code ship sort of deployment for the cookbook, which zips it up, pushes it to S3. Likewise, we'd have a code ship deployment for the actual application code. Now, what's kind of cool about this is what this does is all this does is it says, hey, OpsWorks, go create a deployment for this app ID under this stack, right? So that's automated. And if you look up here, it's for the master branch. So basically, anytime you push to the master branch, it will, on this virtual, you know, VPC that CodeShip has, it will spin up, it'll install the AWS CLI, and basically create an OpsWorks deployment. So let's test this out. So I guess one problem that you have with, we have this WordPress site, right? Wherever the heck it is, and yeah, I could log in.php. A common problem that really kind of hinders you from scaling a WordPress site is media files live on the server, right? So the correct way really to solve that problem is to not store them on the server, right? Store them somewhere like on S3 or just some other,
Could you explain quickly why that's a scaling problem?
Right. So it kind of goes back to this picture, this simpler picture, where you have two app servers, and say I wanted to just add another app server here to respond to more load, right? Well, if there are uploaded files that only exist on, say, this app server, well, obviously they don't exist on this app server, right? So the next client that comes in and says, hey, I need to get that thing that got uploaded over here, but its request gets routed over here, you're like, well, I don't have that file. Sorry about your luck, right? The solution to that problem is to have, store those files not on the individual app servers. Really, the only thing that should be on app servers is, business logic or actual application code. But stuff that has some entry in the database obviously should not only exist on each of these app servers. Otherwise, you have to start duplicating that stuff on each of these. And it's like, why would you do that when you could just centrally store them somewhere else? Common solution to that problem is using an S3 bucket. Okay, so that's actually what I like to do. I'd like to update this server so that when I add a new media file, it actually stores those files on S3. So how do we do that? I want to take just a second and point out the dream. Okay, so if I go back to this the application code, we talked about how the cookbook is just a submodule, and then the actual application code is in its own directory. There's a README here that actually shows you how to get up and running locally, and that is really what the dream is all about. It's making use of the same cookbook you use to provision OpsWorks or whatever cloud infrastructure, right? Using that same cookbook to provision your local dev environment. Okay, and we're going to do that using these sweet things. Okay, so Virtualbox is sort of like VMware. It's just a way to create a virtual machine on top of your host operating system. Vagrant makes it useful, basically. It makes it to where you can script it and things of that nature. Chef has its own development kit, so it allows you to do stuff like you could actually run Chef client the same way you run it on an EC2 instance. You could run it on your host OS to just install stuff like, I want to install Apache on my OS X laptop. You could do that. The problem is that you have lots of different projects, and you'd like for each of those projects to have their own sort of virtual machine to run on, right? So with all these things together, it allows you to spin up a virtual machine and provision it using some of your recipes from your cookbook, right? So to sort of demo that, I guess real quick I'll show you the Vagrant file for this. So what this does is it shares, remember this is from our cookbook directory, and what this is doing is it's sharing the whole application repo directory. That's the thing that we cloned. And it shares it on this virtual machine in Vagrant land. Okay, there's a whole bunch of other stuff in here that basically resolves some problems, some usability problems on different environments like Windows and whatever. But the real sauce here is this. We just say, when you provision the VM, apply these recipes, basically. Okay, and all of this again is made possible by a combination of Vagrant, Virtualbox, and Burkshelf. Right? Burkshelf allows you to manage the dependencies for your cookbook. So this metadata RB again, you notice it needs stuff like PHP and Apache and MySQL, and And what Bergshelf does is it sort of has a local cache of those and uses it when provisioning your dev environment. So I'm actually going to run this. There's a chance that this thing's already running. So what is this start VM thing? Basically, it is a sort of a helper script to basically, and it kind of spells it out here, but if you haven't already initialized your cookbook submodule, remember if we look back here, we have this submodule. When you first do a vanilla, get clone, this is just this stub of a directory that doesn't have any code in it. So you have to run a command. So this start VM, if you look at it here, it actually runs this get submodule update thing, which initializes it, and then it does some other things. But at the end of the day, it's really just trying to run Vagrant up. Okay, and that was the last thing that it did here. Was that now this went rather quickly because I had actually already provisioned this thing. If it's the first time you're running Vagrant up, it's actually going to say, oh, I need to run, it actually says down here, you actually need to, it actually runs Vagrant provision, which runs everything in your Vagrant file, right? It does stuff like apply system dependencies, server, Apache configuration. This actually this is what sort of a convention that I've been doing for my stuff. This dev database thing, what does this do? All this does is it basically installs MySQL, creates a database, and that's it. It literally installs SQL and creates an empty database if it's not there already. Okay? Why is that useful? This basically solves the problem of every project you pull down, you have to install whatever database it wants and then initialize it. This could also be expanded upon to if you're unfortunate enough to inherit some code that you need some sort of SQL dump or Postgres dump to start your database off with, right? You could just as easily bake that into your cookbook code that says, oh, I need to create a database and then I need to immediately put in this initial dump in order to make it work, right? Right, so in the README you'll see, let's see here, it sort of gives you a quick workflow. Actually, this one is pretty simple because I actually just install Apache on the VM. So now running, the other thing that Vagrant does for you is it does port forwarding to for your host OS. So if you look here, this says forward port 80 on my VM to port 8080 to my host operating system. So I should be able to, in a browser, go to localhost 8080 and basically see the same thing I saw running on my OpsWorks stack, right? These are basically the same code. One happens to be logged in right now, but that's fine. Okay? So this just proves that that works. All right? So let's say we want to make a change, right? The problem we want to solve, right, is we want to, instead of storing media files to get uploaded on individual app server instances, we want to store them on S3. So I've actually already done all of that. So let's just look at what's changed, okay? So right off the bat, you can see I added a couple of plugins, right? Add this Amazon Web Services plugin for WordPress and this other S3 and Cloudfront thing. It also looks like there has been some changes to the cookbook. It says modified content. I'm going to give you the briefest tutorial on submodules ever here, but basically, if I cd into chef my app, which is my cookbook submodule, and I run git status again, it looks completely different, right? And unfortunately, it looks like I may need to stash this, but let's just look at the diff for this. So what changed it looks like the system recipe changed. And what used to say just install SendMail, now I'm installing ImageMagick, PHP 5 curl, and this other PHP thing for ImageMagick, right? you never heard of ImageMagick, it's like the go-to thing that it can like convert a PNG to a PDF in like a command line. It's pretty amazing. But basically, this is needed for these plugins to work. So this is an example of I had code changes in my application that require system-level dependency changes, right? Which means that if I just push this code to my app servers that have no idea what ImageMagick or PHP curl is, it just wouldn't work. You'd have to go and manually install that to each one. Chef automates that, right? So, so real quick, I just wanted to show that within the cookbook here, we basically want to commit this stuff. And unfortunately, it looks like I'm actually detached here. So I'm hoping that if I just stash what I did and pull, this is going to be okay. Oh. I think I just need to check out master actually. And now I'm going to pop the thing in my stash shot. There we go. And same diff is here. So I'm gonna commit this really quick. I'm just gonna commit my changes to the system recipe. And I just wanted to, so we're gonna add plugin dependencies. Okay, I'm pushing that. So I just pushed to the master branch of my cookbook repo. Again, I was CD'd into my cookbook directory. That's why all git commands in there are in the context of the cookbook repository. If I CD up a level now and run git status, before this said modified content, now it says new commits. So I can actually add this submodule into a commit for the application repo. Now, just before I lose it here, if I look on here, on CodeShip, it's running a build for the commit that I just did. I added plugin dependencies. What is this doing? This is why CodeShip's pretty amazing. Like it's checking out the code. It's going to run tests if I had any. I don't have any unit tests or anything applied set up for this, but it would. And then if tests pass, it would run any deployments for this branch, which I happen to have one. In particular, it does Burks vendors all my cookbook dependencies together and zips it up, pushes it to S3, which is where OpsWorks intends to go find the cookbook, right? It's taking a sweet time right now. I'm going to go ahead and real quick explain the changes to the application. So if you recall, as part of the code recipe, I used this local config sample. I apply whatever configuration I got from OpsWorks to that template and then spit it out into the thing that is get ignored, the local config.php, right? So what is up with that? So if you look in here, what I did was I added these things to my local config. And in particular, this is credentials required to be able to push files from my WordPress site to an S3 bucket. Okay? Basically, without those credentials, you would not have access to push files to the S3 bucket. This is taking its sweet time. Maybe it just hasn't refreshed.
And those keys are in your app on OpsWorks?
Not yet, I don't think, actually. But what I will demo is that I've already added them to my own, well, I'll just show you in Sublime. I've actually added them into my own local config. Again, this file is get ignored, right? But these are basically my own personal credentials that point to a particular user on the APAX AWS, right? I've actually already set up, if you look, oh great.
Fail. Doing it live.
Just gonna restart that build and see if second time around works. Shoot, what was I gonna show you guys? Right, so locally, I have the site running, right? If I go into the WP admin here, I actually have installed here, if you look at plugins, I have installed those two plugins that are in version control right now, the Amazon Web Services and this thing called WP Offload S3 Lite, right? If I look at access keys for this Amazon Web Services, this plugin is actually pretty slick. It basically says, hey, you probably don't want to access these here because you already have them in a config file, right? You can manage them here, but we're guessing you probably want this in version control, so we're not going to allow your client to screw this up, right? But then on S3 and Cloudfront, this other plugin, this is what's pretty cool, is that it was actually had enough access to create an S3 bucket from here. So this is an example of, I created an S3 bucket just for my local flavor of the site, right? And it's actually has one interesting setting that it has in here is remove files from the server. What does this mean? It means that after when you upload, some file to media, if I go to media, I've actually uploaded a picture here. It uploads all the files that were created, like all the different thumbnail renditions to S3. I can prove that real quick. My app Chris Local. It actually puts it in this uploads directory. So that one file generated a whole bunch of thumbnails, but they all live on here. What I'm trying to get at here is that another option, which probably is what you want to do, is delete the source files that are on the individual app server. This says remove files from servers. Once a file has been copied to S3, remove it from the local server. That sounds awesome. This more info is basically saying, hey, this works 90% of the time, but there are a handful of plugins out there that did not do their job as programmers, basically, to use all, because what these plugins do is that basically when you say, go get me a media file, it says, okay, well, we're actually going to step in and say you're supposed to get this from S3, right? So there's probably a handful of plugins out there that aren't, they just hard-coded, well, I know exactly where they're supposed to be. There are, /content, uploads, whatever, So, yeah, let's see if CodeShip failed again. This is embarrassing. I wonder if this literally broke today for all of our projects.
You pushed the hotfix to mobile server today.
It's true. That is true. But I didn't push to the cookbook. That is embarrassing. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this manually, really quick. So here, I think I actually did this earlier today, or yesterday. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clone this and run those. Let's see. So all this does is it runs Burke's Fender. You do this within the cookbook directory, Wiki?
Books Fender, it needs to be where the books file is.
Right. So again, all this is doing is it's looking at the metadata Ruby file, looking at all the dependencies, and putting them as a sibling directory to this. Sorry, it puts them all in this Burke's Cookbooks thing. So if you look in here, let's make that just one. Sorry. So basically, it put all of our, including our own cookbook, in this and put them all in the same directory. And then it copies Bert's template to Bert's cookbook. And then run zip on it. Cool. Chef my app zip, and I'm just going to manually upload this to a bucket. So chef my app. So we're basically just going to overwrite this file. Where you at? There we go. All right, and you see the timestamp changed. So that's up there. Okay, so unfortunately, CodeShip failed us today. It looks like it's kind of a moving target occasionally. I don't want that to be put off to this because CodeShip's super powerful. I think it's simply related to Ruby something specifically. But what I want to get at here is that on my OpsWorks stacks, I have instances, and yes, they belong to layers. And they say, I have these recipes, and this is where I'm supposed to go get my zip. Unfortunately, one thing that you'd have to do is that when you run a deployment, it doesn't go fetch a fresh copy of the thing that's on S3. And it actually gives you a very awesome command. So when I'm on the stack here, I can run commands, all sorts of types, on whatever instances that I have access to. In particular, I want to run this update custom cookbooks. Which basically goes and fetches a fresh copy of the cookbook that I just pushed a change to.
If you change the zip that it's going to, do you have to explicitly still run that command, or will it like decide, oh, you changed the repository URL, I need to run that? Like if you
That's a good point. I would imagine
still need to explicitly run update cookbook.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Possibly. Okay. Anyway, but I wanted to different direction.
So I guess you could also put just an OpsWorks command as part of your deployment to do what you just did. As far as
Yes, you could. The thing is sometimes you don't always want to do that.
yeah, fair enough.
So yeah. Anyway, so this ran, it succeeded. Really, all it did was went and fetched a new copy of the cookbook and pushed it to this particular server. So real quick though, I wanted to point out here that in my app, I have these environment variables. These are currently filling out my, it's using this template to fill in all the database credentials. But this is saying, oh, well now I need AWS key and secret, okay? So before I commit and deploy the app, I'm going to just go ahead and add these things to my environment. Okay? So if I go up here and edit my app, I can just add a new access key. And in fact, I'm just going to use one for my APAX profile here.
We shared this video at all. If you
Oh.
recycle your access keys.
I didn't think about that.
Let's do some post editing.
Look away! Look away! So this is kind of what I was talking about, how you can specify protected values in your cookbook, right? So I can say that this particular one should be secret, and once I save it, you actually can't get that value back, right? Okay, so these are in here now. That means nothing because I haven't run a deployment on it. So real quick, let's get this thing running. So if I just add all this stuff, it's actually going to have a whole bunch of files in these plugins, I'm assuming, if I run status. So this is all the plugin files. But the real thing, oh, that is what you just did. Sorry?
Oh, okay, that's your...
Right. So originally those were just folders, but those folders had a bunch of files in them, right? So I'm going to say added S3 plugins and media upload, whatever. Okay, so I'm pushing this to the master branch, and again, this should spark an OpsWorks deployment because CodeShip is set up to say when you push to the master branch, do so, right? So if I go back here, let's start a new build, and since we don't do Ruby related things, I'm hoping this actually works. You can just as easily from OpsWorks go to apps and hit deploy an app, and this basically runs the deploy command, but in the context of the AWS console rather than using the AWS CLI like CodeShip is using. But I'm going to let this thing do its.
If you ran deploy from there, how does it? Did you set up how does it know where to get the code to deploy if you ran it from OpsWorks?
So this, CodeShip is just saying it's doing exactly the same thing as clicking deploy in OpsWorks does. It's just saying, hey, run the deploy step for all the layers.
Oh, it's not doing what code deploy did, where it would create a bundle and shove it off.
So basically, this is running the deploy command, and you can actually say which instances that you'd like to do this on, right? But in this context, it's just doing it for that entire app, basically. Or I guess it's the whole stack, yeah.
And then your deploy recipes have essentially a kit for them, right?
Correct. So in the layers for the app servers, so these two have already been run because the instances have been provisioned. Now, if I want to run the setup step, I can. I can do that via running the setup command for whatever instances, if you'd like, right? But for the deploy, when you run deploy, that's a separate, I guess, run list kind of thing, right? So this says go get the code and can initialize your config file, and then also this WordPress thing, all it does is, what's it do? It creates this uploads directory. If it doesn't exist, that's all it is. Because this happens to be get ignored, which is ironic because we're pushing an update right now to abolish the need for that uploads directory. But whatever. This is ridiculous. CodeShip has really dropped the ball right now. So I'm going to just yeah. So it's doing its thing. It's just the UI didn't. Oh, naturally, it's done now. Hooray! So again, what this is doing is it's running the two recipes, the code recipe, which goes in, fetches the code, and then initializes the local config with our sample using the config we got from our application. Right. So this is done, and if I go to first off, let's make sure it still works. Hooray. But if I go into the WP admin now and I go to plugins, I will see two plugins now that have not been activated. Now, this is kind of a pitfall of WordPress, since there are two different databases, right? Because the database is what detects whether a plugin is actually activated or not. But this should work. If I activate Amazon Web Services, and this is pretty awesome, actually. So this error message is actually what caused me to add to my system level dependencies recipe that I needed ImageMagick, PHP curl, all this stuff, right? I never ran that recipe. I ran the deploy steps, again, which are it's code and WordPress, but I did not run setup again, which is system level dependencies, the thing that I changed, right? So how do I fix that? I literally just run the setup command, which for all of my instances that I checked, it runs that setup step. Right?
Well, it's running our deployment strategies baked into ops workflow? Like, can you do rolling deployments, or do you have to like code that yourself?
'Cause Keith and I have yet to find. Well, I really haven't seen anything that points to you being able to do zero downtime, like you're talking about, which is unfortunate. But definitely possible using the AWS CLI.
Right. Yeah, I was just wondering if it was like you
I
have
think
to
it's
code
just
that yourself.
It's
or-
just a configuration setting, you know, setting the options.
Right.
Fix settings.
So unfortunately, what this does is it runs apt-get update. So that might take just a second. Let's see. I know we're running low on time. While that's doing it, this is really my last slide, and it's stuff you should be using. Okay, CodeShip. Obviously, we talked about how that's sort of like the launch point for continuous integration. We use Slack as for team communication. Slack has a bajillion integrations, and something, if you notice, if you ever want to opt a repository into the APAX, was it CI? We have a channel, I can show you really quick, wherever my cursor is. But this APAX CI channel, basically these are all of our repositories that have added this sort of integration into Slack. So that at any given time you can sort of see, oh, this commit just happened. It's pretty nice. OpsWorks or Chef Server, we're kind of going over that. This kind of makes the maintainable thing possible, right? Making it easy to respond to load demand kind of solves that problem as well, because as I showed you, it's super easy to add a new instance. Okay, so this has been provisioned. If I go to here again and refresh, now when I activate my web services thing, it activated because now PHP curl had been installed, ImageMagick had been installed. Remember, all of that happened because all I had to add was this. I added those 3 lines. Okay? And now, along with this stack and with that moment in time in commits and version control, it will live forever, kind of thing. I'm going to activate this other one because it actually depends on this. And if you look at access keys, I should get that same error because on there, baked into the config, are my access keys. Finally, if I go to settings for this guy, this is what's pretty cool about this. You can browse existing buckets, which is kind of cool. But you can also create a new bucket. So I'm actually just going to call this my app, which probably is taken, but I'll try it anyway.
Probably is
Yeah.
taken.
My app test. Get there.
I was gonna say that's.
How about 407? Because it's 407. All right. So basically, we're set up now that when you upload a media file, it goes to S3. The last thing that I'd like to do is turn on this remove files from server. And what that means is after it uploads and processes all the thumbnails and pushes them to S3, it obviously removes them from the server. So you could, in theory, have lots of app servers, and they all say, hey, database, where is this image? And it says, well, it's on S3, right? And they don't look locally. So just to show that I'm not full of crap,
I don't know if I believe you.
I'm just going to pick a random image. That is a screenshot of... How about this Keeneland feature image? Hopefully it's not over 2 megs. So one thing that this definitely does is it... Oh, well, that was pretty darn quick. Never mind. So if I look on S3 now, under my buckets, I want to refresh this just in case. Yeah. So my app 407 is on here now. And if I look in content, uploads, 2016. Oh, that works. I forgot to turn that setting on. Then it has all the renditions of this on here. If I were to SSH in to this individual instance, you would see that it's nowhere to be found on there. So if I look in my app, oh look, there's nothing in there, right? This is where it would normally have put it, right? But it deleted them after it got all of them onto S3, right? So I should be, in theory, be able to stick these instances behind a load balancer and have a bajillion WordPress instances behind it, which I think is possible. I just I was trying to set up the APAX dev domain, which I'm using for this. I had some trouble with register.com trying to get it to point to a subdomain, or point subdomain to a load balancer, whatever. Okay. So that's what I got. I could probably talk about any one part of this forever, but really the point is Chef enables you to write it once and it works everywhere, kind of thing, right? Again, the dream is literally to get this up and running locally. I cloned this repo and ran *VM, and then all of a sudden this showed up. Okay, so that's all I got.
Awesome. Yeah. Earlier you mentioned like something with Bitbucket and SSH key compared to GitHub, or what was that?
Okay, so it actually didn't really apply to this problem or this project because it was a public repo. But a problem I have is that, so in order for CodeShip to work, when you create a CodeShip project, it adds a SSH key. It generates and adds an SSH key using like the CodeShip API or whatever to that that repo. But if you have submodules, both of those have their own CodeShip project, so they have their own SSH key. And unfortunately, when you notice here, as part of the application, it does a submodule update, which basically just goes and fetches all the submodules. Well, your CodeShip SSH key for the app repo is nowhere to be found on the cookbook repo, and it's private, so you just straight up don't have access. So that's easily solved for Bitbucket, but on GitHub I found it interesting that you cannot reuse the same SSH key for two repos for deploy keys. Obviously you can have, like on your user account, you can have.
In Bitbucket you just apply it to the organization or the team or whatever?
No, I copied that public SSH key from the application deployment keys to the cookbook. Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely worth it to note that the initial setup of this and the learning curve is not stagnant, but the payoff is bringing on a new developer is, do you have these three things installed: ChefTK, Virtualbox, Vagrant, and can you run a script, right? And now you have that whole thing set up in a virtual machine on whatever host OS it supports.
Well, and almost as big of a payoff is that like you're running more closely what your production environment is, so you have less of the, well, it works on my machine,
right,
kind of cases.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking the time today to talk to me.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, it's kind of one of those, like, I set off, I learned about Chef, and we were like, well, that solves some problems we have. And then, like, we kept bolting stuff onto the side of it until it was like, oh, this could make bringing on new developers really easily. Because a common problem on any project is, like, you pull it down, and you're like, okay, now you have to install everything you need to get that thing to run. And oh no, yeah, that probably conflicts with some other project you have, right? So.
Yeah, the other advantage is that you're not having anything on your local environment that's not in version control.
Yeah.
So you can reproduce the dev environment anywhere.
Yeah.
So if you lose your laptop.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that I like most about Chef is that it puts the provisioning process in version control. right? Like when you you should at any time be. I mean, in fact, running the start VM script is a good example. Like at any time, if you add something to the code and it needs some system level dependency that you didn't add to the cookbook, you'll know because it just straight up won't work, right? Because you should be able to apply the cookbook to a blank canvas every time.
It's even like for the Presbyterian Church, we had like 12 apps, like separate applications, all running essentially the same server setups, and they did a security scan where they were all running too old of a version of Apache. So we, at the time, like the fix to that was I SSH'd into 12 machines and ran Apache updates. Whereas like this, like add a line to a file.
That would literally be like, I think it's like, you know,
Right. Yeah.
done
Right.
or whatever. I forget what the syntax is. But.
Although we're still having debates over how I should handle stacks in that case, because if I separate those all into separate stacks, it's still 12 separate things.
Right. Yeah, I think
It's a post-GA conversation.
if anybody has a project that they want to sort of apply this to, like at this point I have like 4 or 5 under my belt, so I've kind of ran into everything. Feel free to hit me up.
Chris and I were
But,
debating,
yeah.
should I do separate, different layers
Awesome. Thanks
or
for
different
Yeah, thanks for doing that.